What is going on, guys? It is MurderInc here, and today we're going to be talking about the BatEater teams and which one champion can really help your team if you have multiple to pick from. Now, this is, in my opinion, the greatest clan boss team that's ever been made. It was made by a player named Rust, and it was absolutely brilliant. What you can do with this team is you can one key Ultra Nightmare, Nightmare, Brutal, Hard, Normal, and Easy with the same exact speed tune. Now, with that being said, there are champions that have become very common. As we can see, we're running double ManEater, Painkeeper, and finally Seeker. So there's not even a legendary required to make this team possible with how you need to speed tune it. Now, like I just said, there are very few champions that have kind of made it into the meta of what works best with this. However, I broke down a ton of champions that you can actually use, that some players may have these champions but say, I don't have this, I don't have that, so I shouldn't build this, but that may not be the case for you. So if you know about this team already, try to bear with me for about 5 minutes while I show you my champions for this, so you can kind of get an idea for the speeds if you are considering making this team. As mentioned, we only have one legendary here. I'm using Dracomorph. As you can see, Relentless set, Rule set. He's at 224 speed. That's the important part here. And for his masteries, I do run the counterattack mastery. Now for our other champions, there is some flexibility with the speeds, but this isn't really going to be a BatEater guide. It's more of a list of champions you can use with this to your success. So as we can see here, 6 speed pieces, 246 speed for one ManEater. Now the faster ManEater is going to be 265 speed. Once again, both of them are using the counterattack mastery. And we have our Seeker here, who is now, to my knowledge, not wearing a necklace. Looks like I don't have a valuable necklace, so I'll work on that. So as we can see here, we have 255 speed for the Seeker here. Once again, also using that counterattack mastery. And finally, we have counterattack mastery on the Painkeeper, which is why these speeds are a bit more specific to having counterattack on the Painkeeper, because the normal build can kind of mess things up. But the final speed here is actually going to be 242 for that Painkeeper. So all of my champions are fully booked, and those are the speeds. And kind of to give you an idea, even though I did show it briefly at the start, most endgame and late game players use this team composition in one way, shape, or form because it's rather easy to build, not requiring too many legendaries, and it is rather consistent across the board. So as you can see here, a ton of people using it. They also use it for Nightmare, and many clans have their clan boss list actually looking like this. So the question is, what champions can you use besides the more popular ones that everyone's using to really give you some success in this game? And that's where we're going to go over this list right here. So we have champion, gear set suggestion, strengths, weaknesses for the BatEater review of the 5th slot champion that's really going to make the team work. So the first champion we're going to talk about on the top of the list here is in fact Dracomorph. And what's pretty consistent across the board is Relentless gear sets, highly recommended because extra turns on this champion specifically will not affect the speed tune of this clan boss team at all. So Dracomorph's strengths, he can one key any affinity. For this team specifically, he is going to be the highest damage dealer you can possibly use in this slot here. And he has defense down, weaken, and poisons. Weaknesses, he actually doesn't have any, since that AoE, defense down, and weaken also count for red affinity, and his damage and poisons are so consistent and so high that even on weak affinity with landing weak hits, he will still hit that 1 key threshold, because outside of his weak affinity, he is overshooting what you would actually need for a 1 key. I normally hit it around 39 turns for what's required as a 1 key. I do have exceptional gear, but even if you lower the gear quality, you will still be fine. Moving on next to Fane. Also, once again, I do recommend Relentless gear for this champion. This is a 1 to 2 key, any affinity. She applies defense down, weaken, high mastery damage, and poison on top of things. So the weakness for this champion, she is going to take up an additional debuff slot with that attack down. And one thing you're going to want to do is you're going to want to use a toxic or a poison set on some of your utility champions that are Painkeeper, the ManEaters, or the Seeker, which can make things a little bit difficult because the speeds aren't necessarily low, but they're not as high as we've seen some other compilations for the clan boss where you need 280 speed. This is a bit more realistic, but would still take some gear, which is why I did list it as a weakness. And finally, weak affinity. Fane is going to struggle on the magic affinity, I believe it is, since that is her weak affinity and she cannot overcompensate like Dracomorph actually can to kind of provide that overall success for your team. Now Belanor, once again, I do recommend and suggest Relentless gear for this champion. He can one key any affinity. He has a crit aura, crit buff, defense down, and weaken. And one thing I didn't add here that I probably shouldn't will right now is he has high raw damage. Okay, so those are his benefits there. And as far as weaknesses for someone like a Belanor, poison set once again on utility champions, that could be a stretch. And he also, as a champion itself, has a high gear requirement compared to someone like a Fane or a Dracomorph. Now this is kind of a rather big talking point. Instead of just saying high gear requirement, what does that necessarily mean? For Fane it was quite straightforward. For someone like a Belanor it really isn't. So he does have that crit aura, which allows you to build less crit overall on all of your champions, improving their damage. However, to really maximize the efficiency of someone like a Belanor in Relentless gear, you want to make sure he's doing a solid amount of raw damage to compensate for not having any poisons at all. I wouldn't recommend putting him in a toxic set because he does have fairly good multipliers, and that's going to help a lot in the Relentless aspect of this. So that's one thing I did want to go over. And once again, you're reducing the crit rate needed on every single champion on the team, allowing you to build more crit damage, maybe having it a bit easier to get those toxic sets on those champions, not having to worry about crit rate. So all of these things to consider when trying to min-max with someone like a Belanor on your team. Now the next champion we have is in fact Aina. I do recommend Relentless set. She is a epic champion, so that's a major plus there. Now if you were curious by any chance, I do have a video on Aina as well as Belanor in this specific team composition already available on YouTube. So if you have these champions, you're considering doing it, want to know what you would really need for that gear requirement, I do show the gear in that video, so you can definitely take a look at both of those videos if you have these champions and were interested in attempting to build this. Now for strengths for someone like an Aina, we have one key as long as it's not red affinity: high raw damage, defense down, and weaken. Now weaknesses, once again, poison sets on the utility champions and high gear requirements. This is more straightforward for Aina. She's hard to build, her multipliers aren't amazing but they're still very strong, and she does also provide the extra turn like a Rotos would on the A1 ability, giving her more chances to actually get additional turns, improving her mastery damage overall, so on and so forth. So she's another champion you can one key with. Now moving on to Venus, I do recommend Relentless gear, but you can definitely somehow manage not to use Relentless gear if you're comfortable with a 2 key. Now the only reason I recommended Relentless is because Venus can 1 key. However, in skipping over the strengths momentarily, if you go to weaknesses, the only weakness Venus has is if you want to 1 key with this champion, you need absolutely ridiculous gear, because her base multipliers are not very good. She's a very tanky champion, which is good for everything outside of unkillable. But for unkillable, her main point and purpose is going to be the strengths: defense down, weaken, poison, HP burn, and once again, like I said, great base stats. So it's going to be hard to build her for raw damage. She has amazing debuffs, and there was a recent change to her AI, so she is using HP burn, so that's another debuff for more damage you're going to see out of someone like a Venus, especially if you use her in a Relentless set. So that's where I stand on Venus. Pretty straightforward there. The next champion is Rhazin. Now I have not seen a lot of people using Rhazin, and he's definitely a viable option, so I would recommend Relentless gear. He is going to be a 2 key champion as well. He has high raw damage, defense down, and weaken. You can elect to use a toxic set instead of Relentless for someone like a Rhazin. However, I would probably still stick with Relentless since his raw damage is so high and he has such a high ceiling of damage. That's really the main point there. It's really hard to sacrifice that for toxic gear unless you can build a damage toxic set with the amount of speed he needs, which would be incredibly hard. So for Rhazin, poison set on utility champions, you definitely want that. You want to make sure that since he offers no poisons, kind of like Aina and Belanor, you want at least the weaker poisons to be applied from your support champions. Once again, high gear requirement, although not as high as you would think since you're only really aiming for a 2 key. And as always, weak affinity will prevent him from being able to get a high amount of damage. However, if you can guarantee at least 1 key in Void Affinity, it wouldn't be that hard to 3 key no matter how many weak affinities you do hit in a row on any reset. So it's a solid 3 key team. Now the next parts is kind of where it gets into interesting waters as far as discussion goes for the BatEater. The main purpose of this team is to 1 key and 2 key tops. Now we're getting to the point where we're starting to see some breakdowns where you can 3 key. Now the reason why BatEater is good is because it's the same speed for Nightmare as well as Ultra Nightmare. If you're a player who isn't using 4 keys every single day, this might not be ideal for you. If you are, moving into the 3 key section, it's very possible and probably more optimal than whenever you're using to actually use this team composition. So next we have here Giant Slayer Poisoners. Talking about Nethril, we're talking about Xavia. I can't think of anyone else off the top of my head. I'm probably missing somebody, but that's fine there. So for Nethril and Xavia, 2 to 3 key, high mastery damage, high poison damage because they're constantly applying those poisons. Now this is a very high gear requirement for a 2 key. You definitely want to kind of be leaning towards giving them as much raw damage as possible to add on to that poison damage, because there's going to be no defense down or weaken, and once again weak affinity is going to be an absolute killer for you. So you're going to want to have options if you want to go with the Giant Slayer Poisoner route for this BatEater team. Now I've tested this myself on a Void Affinity boss. I tested Xavia with the same gear I had Dracomorphin, and she did 45 million damage, which is definitely pretty impressive for a team that is kind of built around Draco. I could have built my support champions better to kind of increase the damage overall for my team, but 45 million damage is what I did get, so it's definitely a comfortable 2 key overall, since that does equal to 90 million damage. However, once again, that is assuming that I'm hitting Void only, and I'm not going to be hit with that weak affinity for my 2nd key. This is why I did 2 also to 3 keys, in case you hit weak affinity and you don't have another option of a poisoner to swap in instead of that initial champion. Moving on to a champion like Rotos in Relentless Gear or full damage the first time. Relentless Gear isn't the only suggestion I have. He's someone else who can 2 to 3 key with such high raw damage that he does provide, also with the passive that grants extra attacks, which is very strong. So high gear requirement, as you probably could imagine here, weak affinity as well. Now some people might be wondering, how would Rotos work if once his passive's activated, his turn meter is reset? The grouping of champions we are reviewing right now is always going to be the first champion to go in this rotation. The reason why this works is because even if his passive does proc, he's still in a sense going to be that first champion going in that turn. So that's why these things kind of matter a lot. So he's kind of in the same boat as Giant Slayer Poisoners. The one positive for someone like a Rotos, if you do look at the weakness on top of high gear requirement, weak affinity, you can also have a poison set on your utility champions, which is different from the Giant Slayer Poisoners. So you're also getting additional benefit from that. We also have a defense down from Rotos, overall improving the quality of the team that Rotos can actually bring to this, once again, as long as it isn't weak affinity. And then finally, for our last section here, we have Warmaster Poisoners. This is going to be gear set suggestion, player discretion based on whatever champion you're using. If you're using somebody like a Frozen Banshee, probably recommend something like a Relentless set for her, since she's really dependent on having that poison sensitivity actually down to make sure she's actually getting poison damage off on the boss. Now if you wanted to use someone like a Cult Brawler, I would recommend Relentless gear that also provides full damage, or just full damage altogether. I think that would be really good for someone like him. And this, unfortunately, it's possible to 2 key. I won't say it's impossible to 2 key. It will be a lot harder, and it's going to be a bigger investment. And we'll get to my weakness point in a second. But I did list this as a 3 to 4 key if all you really care about is Ultra Nightmare. And Ultra Nightmare is one of the best sources, if not the best source in the game, for actually getting free rewards each day based on the keys you have. You can definitely use this to your advantage and 4 key with this team composition until you get another champion that can really perform well for you. Now getting onto the weaknesses, there are a bunch of weaknesses for this specific Warmaster Poisoner section of this spreadsheet. However, this is where you have to consider other compositions may be a better investment. So what do I mean by other compositions? If you have all of the champions needed for BatEater, and your only viable option is in fact Warmaster Poisoners, it might be better to just run a double Maneater team. That way you can use 3 champions that are free and available for you to pick and choose who you want. So if you have 3 other champions, you can use a Tayrel for a defense down, you can use any type of weakened champion you want, and then you can also finally use that 3rd poisoner there, and it might be closer and on par with getting you that 2 key or even 3 key, instead of having a consistent 3 to 4 key here. That's something to consider. Now, once again, I'm not saying you cannot pull this off, but it's definitely going to be a little bit harder, and you should raise that question in your head if this is a deciding factor for you. And as always, we can see on the bottom here, consider book costs on an account to account basis. I'm not going to say the book value is this, the book value is that, because it's going to be different for every single player in this game. Some people have legendary books that they've been saving for a long time and haven't found a champion that's worth investing in. Maybe there's someone on this list that you would now invest in to make this team composition actually come true for you and give you some more consistency in the clan boss. So that's my guide. Those are my thoughts on the best 5th option champion and best, I don't really want to say poisoner since some of these champions don't poison, but I think the best way to describe it is the best 5th man option for a BatEater composition. And you guys can let me know what champions did I possibly overlook here. I have tested every single champion on this in this actual team composition, so that is one thing. I haven't tested any Warmaster poisoners, but I took a bunch of screenshots from people who actually did, or I actually added them to this list. So that's what we're working with here. Did I miss anybody that you've used to your excess? Definitely let me know in the comments. And did you find anybody on this list that you didn't really consider and you may now consider and actually going after this awesome team composition? Before I conclude the video, I do want to once again shout out Rust for making this. As I said before, in my opinion, this is the most game-changing clan boss team that's ever been made, since it does work for every single difficulty of clan boss in this entire game, for any affinity in the game. So that's kind of a ridiculous team to actually come up with. Very game changing, as I said. So huge shout out to Rust, in fact, and thank you for making this team. I know you increased the account progression and success for so many players by making this, so I definitely want to give proper and well-deserved credit to Rust, since, I mean, when he first explained this to me, I really couldn't believe it. And I said, this is going to be literally, as I've said 5 times, game changing. So as always, guys, if you enjoyed this content, don't forget to smash that like button, subscribe, turn on the notification bell, and I will see you all in my next upload.